Okay, so a little over a year ago, we finished up a set of sermons through Genesis 1 through 11. And here's what we're doing today. We're starting a new set of sermons, and we're picking up right where we left off in Genesis 1 through 11, and we're picking up right there in Genesis chapter 12. But before we jump in to chapter 12, we need to do a little bit of a recap and sort of just walking back through again to make sure we've got the context in Genesis 1 through 11 back in sort of our mind so that we can see where we are in the story. So if you remember back to Genesis 1:1, it's one of those famous verses in the Bible. The first four words go like this: in the beginning, God. The fourth word in the Bible is the word God. He is the subject. God is the subject of the first sentence, and he's the subject of the first sentence because he is the subject of the Bible. He is the main character in the Bible. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God, and then we learn what God does. Created the heavens and the earth. When you think about the Bible, I think it's important to know that it's written with a purpose. And that purpose, one of the ways you could talk about the purpose of the Bible is to reveal God to us. Hey, this is how God discloses himself and how he invites us to know more of him is through the Bible. And in the first line of the Bible, here is what we learn about God. We learn that God is eternal, that God has always been. In Genesis 1:1, it essentially is recording the beginning of the universe. But that is not the beginning of God, because God has always been. He has always existed. God is eternal. And that always existing God, who is the maker of everything, he made it all by the word of his mouth. He's powerful. This is the God that we're introduced to in verse 1. And then after preparing the world that he has made for his people, God's final act of making was our first parents, Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are unique among God's creation. They have a unique role and a unique place in God's creation because they are made in the image of God. And part of what it means to be made in the image of God is their job is to reflect God. And everything, if you know the storyline of the Bible, everything's going great for 2 chapters. They're reflecting God. Everything is wonderful. Everything is as it should be. Life is perfect. Adam and Eve are living in God's place with God himself. He is dwelling there among them. It's going great. And then you get to chapter 3. And in Genesis chapter 3, rather than reflecting God, Adam and Eve, our first parents, rebelled against God. They listened to the lies of the serpent, to the lies of Satan. And they bit into that forbidden fruit. And with that rebellion, that little moment of rebellion right there, listening to those lies, eating that forbidden fruit, with that moment of rebellion came all out ruin. And let that just be a reminder for us this morning. Doesn't sin always come to us coated in sugar? I mean, this is how it comes, right? It tastes so good. Even that first bite is amazing. This is how sin presents itself to us. But the core is always bitter. Sin promises life, but it produces death every single time. That's what Genesis 3 is reminding us of. So friends, don't believe the lie of sin. Don't fall for the sugar. Right? No, the core is always bitter. And that first sin carried bitter consequences. If you read forward in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve are left naked and ashamed. They're left scared. They're left hiding from God and one another. And then in Genesis 3, God pronounces his judgment on their sin. He curses the serpent. He curses the woman. He curses Adam, the man, and even the universe itself. But in the ruins of their sin, there is a ray of light. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we have the Bible's first promise. Genesis 3:15 announces the promise that through one of Eve's offspring, through one of Eve's kids, there's going to be a son coming, and this son will reverse the curse. Everything that sin's done, this son will undo. This son is going to save the human race. He is going to crush the head of the serpent. That's the promise of Genesis 3:15. There is a serpent crusher coming. And now the question becomes, in the Old Testament, who is that person? Who is the serpent crusher? That is the question that is driving the Old Testament. It's the question underneath every page of the Old Testament. Who is that promised one? And with every birth comes anticipation. Will this be him? Surely this is the one. And then with every life comes great disappointment. No, it's not the one. They're a fallen sinner just like the rest of us. And the Old Testament, through the ups of anticipation and the downs of disappointment, the Old Testament is tracking the promise of that serpent crusher who will come through Eve's crooked family tree. That's what the Old Testament is doing. And by the way, this is a really good way to think about Genesis. This is what Genesis is doing. Genesis is paragraph after paragraph of promise tracking. That's what's happening in the book of Genesis. By the way, this is why Genesis is arranged by genealogies. This is how Genesis is sort of set up. So when you read Genesis, you read in your English Bible 50 chapters, right? That's how our Bible is arranged. But those chapter additions were added later to kind of help you get around in the Bible, know where you are, kind of have a verse and chapter for every place in the Bible. That's there to serve you, but they weren't there in the original. So the original has 10 chapters that make up Genesis. There's really 10 chapters that make up the book. And each of those chapters start with, these are the generations of. Genesis is a book of genealogies. Those genealogies are tracing the promise generation by generation. This is who, from whom, the line of the serpent crusher. That's what's happening throughout Genesis. So we get to the first branch of Eve's family tree. Adam and Eve have a son, Cain. And when you're reading in Genesis 4, you're like, surely this is going to be the one. You have all of this anticipation. Cain's name means he's here. I mean, surely this is the promised one, but Cain is no Christ. He turns out to be a killer, right? He kills his brother Abel. So you just keep tracking the promise. Genesis keeps tracing who is that promised one. Where is he going to come? It's not through Cain, but we learn it's through one of Adam and Eve's other kids, Seth. And then you have Seth that's having kids, and it's going to be through Enoch, and then it's going to be through Methuselah, and then it's going to be through Lamech. Right, so you have the promises that are coming down through this one line. You could think of Genesis as creating this funnel so you can see who is the serpent crusher going to come through. It's not these, it's going to be this singular line. And at the same time as it's tracing this singular line, it is contrasting that with the craziness and the darkness of all of these other lines in the world, all of these other families of the world. The rest of the world is descending into just all-out wickedness, right? The wickedness gets so deep and so dark that God sends a flood of judgment in Genesis chapter 6. Right? He floods the earth because the darkness was so deep. But God preserves one family, the son of Lamech, Noah. And Noah has some sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth. And we learned that the serpent crusher is going to come not through Ham, not through Japheth, but through Shem. But the darkness then descends again, right? This is just the story of Genesis 4 through 11. Noah's descendants, they gather in defiance against God. Right, they all gather together in Babel, and they build this huge tower to make a great name for themselves. Just like our first parents, right? It's just a redo of Genesis 3. Rather than reflecting God, they rebelled against God. The rebellion continues. So again, in judgment, God comes down. He confuses their language. He scatters them across the known world. Right? If you want to think about Genesis 4 through 11, life east of Eden, after the Garden of Eden, here is what it is. It's just a picture of human depravity. It's a picture of the darkness that is in every human heart east of Eden. It's a picture of the wreckage and ruin that sin brings. That's Genesis 4 through 11. But in chapter 12, that ray of light flashes again into the darkness, into the wreckage, into the ruins. Chapter 12, verse 1, we read this. Now the Lord said to Abram. There is your ray of light. Now, what is about to be said following this little introduction? Now the Lord said to Abram, what's about to be said is probably the most important statement. It's the most important moment in Genesis, and maybe the most important in the entirety of the Old Testament. Everything before Genesis 12 is anticipating what's about to be said in Genesis 12. Everything after Genesis 12 is looking back and then fulfilling what is said in Genesis 12. This is a huge climatic moment in the storyline of the Bible. One commentator, he said it this way: no one can understand the Old Testament. Okay, so if you want to understand the Old Testament, here it is. He says, no one can understand the Old Testament without understanding Abram. For, he says, the history of redemption begins right here. This is a huge moment in the biblical story. So again, think of the first 11 chapters as prologue in the Bible. Right, it's all the sort of lead up. It's sort of world history. So think about all the things you have going on in chapters 1 through 11. You get the creation of the universe, the creation of marriage, the first sin, the promise of a serpent crusher. You've got the development of civilization. You've got a flood. You've got all the nations beginning to form across the known world. And Genesis 1 through 11 is covering thousands of years of history. But then you get to chapter 12 and the next 39 chapters in Genesis, and everything slows down. It's now a crawl as the story zooms in on one man and his family. 4/5 of the book, one man and his family. That's what's happening as we move forward in the book of Genesis. Now, when most of us read Genesis, we're like, but man, I wanted more like insight and some more questions answered on how the world was made. I mean, could we like get another chapter or two on the creation account? Could we do that so that all of our questions could be answered? But the Bible is not a story that is trying to answer all of our creation questions. It's trying to answer the redemption questions. How are you going to be saved? That's the story of the Bible. How are you ever going to be rescued from your sin? How will the serpent ever be crushed? How will the curse ever be reversed in our life? That's the question that the Bible is trying to answer. So here's what we're going to do today in our text. I want to just help you see 3 things out of Genesis 12. 3 things that I want you to see out of our text this morning. Here's the first thing. I want you to see the promise. These promises that you're going to find in Genesis 12 really carry the whole Bible along. The whole Bible is written to sort of fulfill these promises that we are seeing right here in Genesis 12. And Genesis 12 contains 6 promises. These promises are going to have some near-term fulfillment, like in the life of Abraham and his immediate descendants. And then it's going to have these long-term descendants that are long-term fulfillment that you and I are even now anticipating, this bright future that's in front of us that all starts right here with these promises from God. Here are the 6 promises in Genesis 12. Number 1. God says, Abraham, I will make of you a great nation. Promise number 1, Abraham, a great nation's coming from you. Abraham, from you will come not just a person, but a peoples. That's what's flowing out of you, Abraham. Now, what makes this promise so crazy is how we're introduced to Abraham. So you see this in the previous chapter, starting in chapter 11, verse 27. Says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah is not a random person in the story. He is of the line of Shem. He's all fitting in with this tracing the generations, right? Tracing the line of promise right down through the generations. So now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and Sarai was barren. She had no child. Now, Abram, that's who we meet here in Genesis 12, that name means exalted father. Later on in the story, God is going to rename Abram to Abraham. Abraham means the exalted father of many. Okay, that's what his name means. Now, the only thing worse than being named exalted father when you have no kids is to be renamed the exalted father of many when you have no kids, right? I mean, it's just irony here. It's like, are you serious, God? What are you doing here? But God comes to Abraham, a barren man. He cannot have kids, and says, from you, nations are coming. He goes on to say, hey, look up at the stars. That many people are coming. Hey, look down at the sand of the seashores there. That many people are coming. That's the peoples that are going to flow from you, Abraham. Now, I want you to notice that God is already establishing the pattern of his promise. Right? And here's the pattern. God is saying, what I'm promising Abraham, you will not be able to do on your own. Like, human ingenuity is not going to be able to come through on these promises. So these are bigger than what you can do, Abraham. You can't make yourself have kids. You're not going to solve the problem of your barrenness, Abraham. No, my promises are going to require my power. This is the pattern. God is saying, what I promise will require my power. So you need to get ready for that. You're going to have to trust in that you can't do it, only I can do it. So he comes, promise 1, and says, I will make of you a great nation. Here's promise number 2. Abraham, I will bless you. Blessing is the favor of God on a person and for a purpose. That's blessing. And blessing is directly connected to the presence of God in a person's life, his covenantal presence. Not just like God is everywhere at all times. It's not his omnipresence, it's his covenantal presence, that he's there with you, which means he's also for you. That blessing is connected to that presence. This is why Joseph prospered when he was in prison. This is why he gained favor with the prison guard while he was in prison. Why is that? It was because the text says God was with him. The witness of God leads to the blessing of God. And God is saying to Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to be with you in a way that will bless you. I'm going to be a blessing to you, Abraham. Promise number 3, I will make your name great. Now, this is the problem in Genesis 11, right? The people gathered in Babel and they built this tower to make a name for themselves, a great name for themselves. This was the problem there. But again, God is saying, let me remind you the pattern. Right? My promises will not be fulfilled by human doing. My promises will require my power, Abraham. So it's not, Abraham, you go make your name great. No, God is saying, Abraham, I will make your name great. Abraham, you're going to be like a window, and people are going to see through your life to me and my greatness, Abraham. Your greatness is really about my greatness, Abraham. Abraham, I will make your name great. Promise number 4, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. Right? You see that there in verses 2 and 3. This is God saying, Abraham, there will be a million threats to the promise. Millions of them. There's going to be threats around every corner to the promises that I'm making to you. People will be a threat. Nations will be a threat. Famine will be a threat. You, Abraham, you're going to be a threat. Infertility is going to be a threat. Threats are going to be everywhere. But Abraham, I will protect my promise. Now, this is what God's saying. I will see my promises through. You can trust me, Abraham, to protect my promise. There's no person, Abraham. There's no nation. There's no people. Not even you, Abraham. There is no problem that can stop my promises. Abraham, I will protect my promise. Abraham, there's a serpent crusher coming. And he's coming through you, Abraham, and nothing will stop my purposes. Nothing can block my agenda, Abraham. Promise number 5, in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. In you, the whole world, the nations will be blessed, Abraham. This is God coming to Abraham and saying to Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to bless you, Abraham, but those blessings are not meant to terminate on you. They're meant to flow through you, Abraham, so that they can get to the nations, so they can get to the ends of the earth. Abraham, that's what your great name, that's what these blessings that I'm going to bestow upon you, that's what they're meant to be. That's what they're meant to do. They're meant to flow through you. Abraham, you're not meant to be a collector of blessings. You're meant to be a dispenser of these blessings. Through you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, welcome to what the rest of the Bible is about. This is the story of the Bible, is God fulfilling this promise. Now, in the next 10 chapters, we're going to see this promise sort of be worked out. The Lord is going to bring into existence the nation of Israel. And it's to these people that God showed himself. It's to these people that God made these precious promises. It's to these people that God gave the scriptures. It's to these people that God gave a temple, right, in which he would dwell among his people, at which they could atone for their sins so that they could be right with God. That's the people of Israel, and God's going to create that nation of Israel so that all the nations could then see and know the God who created them. That's the purpose of the nation of Israel. And it's through this family tree Right? This tree that started with Eve, it came down through Noah, then it landed on Abram, and it's through that family tree that the serpent crusher did come. 2,000 years after this promise to Abraham, a descendant of Abraham, a teenage virgin conceived by the Holy Spirit, she became pregnant, and there in Bethlehem, a little baby was born. And that little baby's name was Jesus. And the Bible tells us why his name was Jesus. It's because he will save his people from their sins. Jesus was the promised one. And it's through this one man, Jesus, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So Paul says in Galatians 3:8-9, and the scripture, for seeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, Abraham, in you shall all the nations be blessed. And then look at verse 9. So then, those who are of faith, if you have put your faith in Jesus, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. That's amazing. Paul is saying any person from any peoples can cry out in faith to Jesus, and they can receive the redemptive blessings along with Abraham. That it is through this man that all the earth should be blessed. And Paul is saying it's happening. Every person who puts their faith in Jesus is a part of these promises. It has this blessing upon their life. And then this is what we see happening in the book of Acts. The gospel spreads beyond the Jewish people to all of these Gentiles. It spreads throughout the known world and eventually to the unknown parts of the world. And eventually to America and eventually to Texas of all places. And eventually to Midlothian, and now we, the people of Stonegate, are gathering together as the recipients of this blessing. Is that not amazing? That is God coming through on his promise. And now the recipients, you and I, of these blessings, we get to look forward to the future fulfillment of this, of all the families of the earth being blessed right there through Abraham. The future fulfillment of this, the big time, the meta fulfillment of this comes in Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, when John, looking at heaven, this bright future in front of us, says, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude. How big is the multitude? That no one could number. And where are they from? From every nation, from all tribes and people and languages. They were standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and they were crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. This is God, starting in Genesis chapter 12, saying, from you, Abraham, a barren man will come peoples. And from those peoples would come the promised one, a person, Jesus. And from that one, an uncountable number will gather with God forever around the throne. Abraham, that's what I mean with this promise. And that's the ultimate fulfillment of this promise. This is God saying to you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Then you get to promise number 6. You see it, it's embedded, implied in verse 1, go to the land that I will show you. But then you see it explicitly in verse 7. To your offspring, Abraham, I will give this land. So God's not just going to create a people for Abraham, he's going to give Abraham's people a place. Now in the Old Testament, that was the promised land, the land of Canaan. But when you fast forward to the end of the story, we know that the promised land is really not just a tract of land in the Middle East. The promised land is the new heavens and the new earth that God's preparing for his people, where God will dwell with his people forever. That's what's in front of us. That's the future fulfillment of this promise in Genesis chapter 12. So if you want to take those 6 promises and boil them down into 3, here they are. God is saying, Abraham, I'm going to give you a people. I'm going to give you a place, number 2. And Abraham, I'm going to bless you. A people, a place, and a blessing. That's the promise of Genesis 3 that carries the rest of the biblical narrative forward. Second thing I want you to see is the promise maker. The promise maker. I can't spend much time here, but let me just be brief with it. The promises of Genesis chapter 12 show the heart of the promise maker. That's what the promises do. The promises show the heart of the promise maker. So one question we should ask when we read Genesis 12 is, why in the world is God selecting, choosing, calling Abraham? Why Abraham? What's the reason for that? Here is the only answer you can give for why Abraham. Grace. That's it. Grace. That is the only reason God set his affection on Abraham and called him. Joshua chapter 24 tells us what Abraham and his family were up to prior to God calling him. So they're in Ur, and this is what they were up to in Joshua 24. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, all the way over there in Ur. Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then, in the middle of them serving other gods, I took your father Abraham from beyond the river. Here is what Abraham and his family were doing prior to the call. They were worshiping the moon god. That was kind of their idol of choice. They were moon-worshiping pagans. That's Abraham, that's his family. That's what they were doing there in Ur. They're just oblivious to God. So this was not God looking at Abraham and he's like, there's my man. There's the faithful one. There is the one worshiping me out of all of it. No, it wasn't that. It's the opposite of that. They are pagan moon worshipers. That's Abraham. So when you get to the why Abraham question, God's call on his life wasn't because of Abraham's goodness. It was because of God's grace. That is the only explanation for why Abraham. And friends, his story is our story. If you are in on these promises that God made to Abraham because you put your faith in Jesus, it's not because of your goodness, it is because of God's grace. God set his affection upon you. He called you. He brought you into his family and into all of these amazing promises, this bright future that he has ready for his people. It is all of grace. The promises show the heart of the promise maker, the gracious heart of the promise maker. And then lastly, we get to the response. What did Abraham do in light of all of these promises that God is making to him? What was Abraham's response? Abraham responded by following God in faith. That's his response. He followed God in faith. Now, it's funny if you look throughout the Bible, different people are known for different things. So if you take our man David, David is known as the man after God's own heart. If you get to Solomon, what's Solomon known for? Wisdom, right? Now, when we get to Abraham, what is Abraham known for? What is it? Faith. That's what he's known for. He is the man of faith. This is the thing Abraham is known for. And it's going to be one of the themes that just keep popping up and showing up in the chapters that are out in front of us. Now, what is faith? Let me just give you a simple working definition. Faith is trusting what God says over what you see. That's faith. It's trusting what God says over what you see. I love how Charles Spurgeon once talked about it. He said, here's the essence of faith. It's casting all of oneself, not part of oneself, not a quarter of oneself. It's casting all of oneself upon the promises of God. That's faith, right? It is trusting what God says over what you see. Now, this is what I love about the story of Abraham. Abraham shows us that none of us start out in our Christian life mature in our faith. That's not where any of us start out. God has to get us on a journey of growing us in our faith, of teaching us what it looks like to walk by faith. And this was true of Abraham. Abraham started out with what we might call a weak faith. That's where he started. So remember, when we get to Genesis chapter 12, this is actually the second time God has called out to Abraham. So in Genesis 12, he is living in Haran. But this is the second time, not the first time God has reached out and called to Abraham. The first time, you can see it in Acts chapter 7, Joshua 24. The first time God reaches out and calls to Abraham, he is not in Haran, he is in Ur, right? He's the moon worshiper back then. Right? He's in Ur as a pagan. And it's in that moment that Abraham responds to the call of God. But he responds by going halfway. He doesn't go all the way to the land that God was going to show him. He stops halfway in Haran. And this is how you might could think of Abraham's journey. It started there with a halfway faith, just a weak faith. Abraham is still hedging his bets. Right? He's still withholding some of himself. He's still sort of diversifying his options. I want to make sure that if God doesn't come through, I've still got a few other sort of lines in the water and I'm going to be okay. Right? This is Abraham. This is where he started, with a weak faith. But that weak faith turned into a growing faith. In Genesis chapter 12, he does respond to this second calling of God. He leaves Haran and he makes it to the land of Canaan. You see that in verse 5. Now, it's hard to overstate how difficult this call of God was in his life. God calls him and says, I want you to leave your country, right? That's kind of the widest concentric circle. I want you to leave your kindred. It's like your extended family. I want you to leave your father's house, Abraham. I want you to leave all of that security, and I want you to come to the land that I will show you. That is such a hard thing to do in that day and age. They didn't have Zillow, right? They couldn't look ahead, see how the housing market is, see where they didn't have that. They didn't have Google, right? They're not checking on how the schools are, make sure the kids are okay. They're not checking about how the job market is, making sure it's going to be okay there, finding that job somewhere. They didn't have any of that. It is picking up your life's possessions and just moving into a place you have no idea where it is, what it's going to be like. That's what he is doing here. And they make it all the way into the promised land, and then it says they make it to Shechem. Now, Shechem is right in the middle of the promised land. It's at the heart of the land promised by God to the people of Israel, right there in the center of it. And there in Shechem, he comes to the oak of Moreh. And verse 6 is giving us the tension here. So God is saying, this is the land that I have for you, Abraham, but there's some Canaanites in the land. Now, when you think of the Canaanites, you need to think barbaric idol worshipers. That's the Canaanites, barbaric idol worshipers. Later, when Israel comes into this land, God says to them, I want you to cut down their groves. Now, why would God say that? Well, the Canaanites would take newborn babies, they would put them in clay pots, they would bury them alive under a newly planted tree as a way to incite their gods to bless their crops. That's the Canaanites. Right? And Abraham comes to Shechem, right in the middle of Canaanite, that world, and he comes to the oak of Moreh. Moreh means teacher. So most commentators agree this is likely a Canaanite altar. Now this is the first thing that happens. He comes to the land that God has shown him. Right in the middle of that land, he is coming face to face with the idols of their day, with the idols of that land. This is his first chance to compromise. He's there in the land, and here's his decision. Am I going to worship Yahweh, or am I going to worship the gods of this land? Am I going to take a little bit of Yahweh worship and mix it with a few of the local idols? Am I going to compromise? What am I going to do here? And in the middle of this moment, God shows up a third time to Abraham in verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring, Abraham, I will give this land. So what does Abraham do? So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. This is like going to Las Vegas and you planting a church right there in the middle of the heart of Vegas, right? This is you going to the hardest, most pagan, most hostile place you could find, and then right there in that place, you raising the flag that says you're on Team Jesus. That's what Abraham is doing here. This is Abraham's declaration that here's whose team I'm on. I'm on God's team. I'm on Yahweh's team. This is Abraham. This is him growing in his faith, and that growing faith then turns into a great faith. Genesis chapter 22 is the climatic moment of faith in Abraham's life. Abraham so trusts the promises of God that when God asks for his son, Abraham says, you can have him, God. You can have him. Because if you take my son, I will trust that you will raise my son back to life. That is some next level faith right there, isn't it? I mean, that is some legit next level faith. And listen, that didn't happen overnight, that great faith. No, God slowly grew his faith through testing. Now, what is a test? When we say God is testing your faith, what does that mean? Well, a test is any moment when there's a gap between what God says and what you can see. See, when what God says and what you can see overlap, you don't need faith in those moments. You're just going to walk right into the moment. But when there is a gap between what God says and what you see, then there's a test. Will you step into that? Will you trust what God says over what you can see? Now, a test is when you can't see how the promises of God fit with your flourishing. God, if you love me, how do I have this cancer? God, if you love me, why does this person I love, why did they die? Test. A test is the moment your wisdom seems more trustworthy than God's wisdom. It's the rich young ruler. He comes to Jesus, what must I do to be saved? Well, how about this? Why don't you sell everything you have and come and follow me? And the rich young ruler's like, there's no way that could be wise. Do you know what you're asking of me? There is no way this is prudent and makes sense. No, Jesus, this is not right. Right? There's your test. When your wisdom seems more trustworthy than God's wisdom. A test is the moment when obedience to Jesus costs you something that you really want in life. And my hand is closed around this thing, and God says, no, that's the thing you're going to have to open your hand to. That's the thing I want in your life. A test occurs when obedience to Jesus leads to a kind of death that will require some kind of resurrection to resolve. That's a test. A test occurs when you have to leap toward God, and this leap feels like it may kill you, but you have to leap toward God before you know how he'll catch you. That's a test. I recently read a story about impalas. There's some amazing animals. They're like the jumpiest animals out there, right? It's like 30, 35 feet at a single bound. That's what an impala can do. Now, you would think that it would be impossible to keep an impala in an enclosure, right? But zookeepers have found a way, and here's the way. They have found that impalas won't jump unless they can see where they're landing. Unless they can see the place where their feet are going to come down. Now, if you're a zookeeper, all you have to do is keep the landing hidden, and impalas don't jump. They stay in the enclosure, everything's amazing. Now, when you think about that, is there not so much of that in us? That we want to see the landing before we'll jump to God? We want to see before we'll trust what he says. That just is so in us. We want to wait until we can see everything. And then when we can see everything, then we'll jump toward what God says. But if you want your faith to grow, that's not the way it works. You have to jump before you can see. You have to trust what he says before you're going to see these things. This is how God grows us. Now, here's the thing I love about the story of Abraham, though. In Abraham's story, we do see that God will test us. But even more importantly, we see that God will never fail us. That's what the story of Abraham shows us. God will never fail. Friend, he will not fail you. And you know what that frees us up to do when we believe that, when we see this start to play out in this story? It frees us up to walk by faith, not by sight. It frees us up to jump toward what God is saying in our life. Friend, he will not fail you. Years ago, I was reading a sermon by Charles Spurgeon, and this one little line stuck out to me. He said, "As for his failing you, never dream of it." That's my prayer for us as we journey through this story with Abraham. That when we think about the Lord failing us, that would feel so crazy for us. So crazy that we could never dream of it. Amen? Why don't you pray with me? I want to give you just a moment here to interact with the Lord and to be present with the Lord. Where does faith need to show up in your life right now? Like, where is that test in your life? Where is there that gap between what God says and what you can see? That's where faith really counts. And friend, wherever that is this morning, I just want to encourage you to leap toward God. He will not fail you. He will not fail you. So Father, would you meet us now in this moment? Would you show us those areas where you're growing our faith, testing our faith? And Father, would you give us the belief, the courage to know that, Father, you'll be there on the other side of it. That you, our God, will never fail us. It's in the good name of Jesus that we ask it. Amen.